Okay, I think we're up and running. All right, so we previously have kind of talked about working through translations, worked with some localization, and started to get into that, that whole bit. That also kind of ties in with making your layouts often responsive, because you might find, hey, for this language, maybe I need a slightly different layout in different ways, you know. Whether it be the layout needs to be right to left, whether that be, hey, the buttons need to be a little bit wider, or that being a larger change to how you actually put things because of the size of text that you're working with in particular. So that can mean a lot of things. It also oftentimes, for some languages, it also means using a different keyboard. You know, the base keyboard that you have is just QWERTY keyboard. Most languages have their own keyboard. In fact, for a lot of Asian language, Japanese and Chinese variants, there are actually keyboards where you can draw instead of there being keys. So you can actually draw characters, and there's more of a stylus sort of setup for some languages and some devices, more than just looking like it's a physical keyboard, because there's enough characters for those languages. So those are some things to keep kind of a big heads up. Oftentimes, you know, two issues that you're going to run into is, hey, you have a button that's X amount of width, and the text goes over the edge, right? That's one thing that's going to happen when you go to other languages, right? And we kind of talk, usually that's as simple as just saying, hey, either I am going to set this to wrap content, which is generally the easiest fix, and just say, hey, just make it as wide as the text actually is, or it's about going to a minimum width instead of setting the width specifically to that. The other thing that can happen, so this over. The other thing that can happen is when you're setting out layouts, the kind of old way to set up forms would be something like this. Kind of used to be the standard way of putting forms into pages, and you saw this on the web, you saw this in Windows. And it kind of made sense when we have monitors that were primarily 4x3, that were basically square, or you're just talking about laptops where the screen is more wide than it is tall, right? Because this saves on vertical height by using more horizontal width, right? And so that works okay in a desktop environment. It's kind of, that's really what it's optimized for. But it's less optimal on smaller screens, mobile devices, simply because it uses so much horizontal space, right? When we're talking about most, you know, smartphones, tablets, you generally have more height and less width, right? You're talking, usually people are using things in portrait and not using things in landscape, okay? So a layout like this is not so much what we see on mobile. We tend to see things more like this. First name with your field here, last name with your field there, okay? This works better on a portrait side versus this is more optimized for landscape type of orientation. Does that make sense to everybody? So anytime you have these form fields, you're usually going to see that sort of behavior. And sometimes they'll even change, right? Sometimes you'll dynamically or responsively kind of just adapt to the screen size and switch between one or the other, right? In fact, it might be something like, hey, maybe on your phone, right? This is in portrait, this is in landscape, or it might just be oftentimes on a tablet. It's big enough that you can do this in both orientations, right? So this is a common place where those kind of things switch. You know, being vertical versus being horizontal. Okay. The other thing that factors into what we talked about in terms of localization, recognize that we need to translate these strings, right? Anytime you have a label, it's something you need to translate. You need to put it into the user's language, okay? Is there a difference between these two layouts in terms of translation? Yeah.
I think when we go back to what we talked about in terms of different languages, some are right to left, so if you're using one on the right, you maybe want to put that on the right side.
Yeah, so on the, if I was trying to set this up for Hebrew, I'd actually need to switch the labels over here. And so the field's going to be there, right? So labels would need to switch over if I'm talking about right to left. Versus here, I just right align the label and I'm done. Not a big change to layout, it's just alignment of the label text. Here it's more to it. The good news is as long as you're aligning to start and end, a lot of that stuff will still happen. You know, because if this is, say, aligned to parent start, if that's where your constraint is over here, and your constraint over here is parent end, right? And obviously these things are aligned to each other. That whole horizontal layout will flip this by, okay? Because the parent end is going to go over there and the parent start goes over here. So a lot of times it will go ahead and work if you're going ahead and using the layout editor. It's kind of set up to work mostly for right to left languages. What's the other thing that usually comes up? What did I just say about the button? I don't want text flowing out of where it's not supposed to be, right? So when we're talking about buttons, I say usually, hey, it's this in English, but then it's that in Spanish, right? I potentially need to make things wider. Is everybody on the same page there? Okay.
So in that instance, would it maybe be better to use, like, if it's possible, like maybe like icons, or like a picture on the button? Like, for instance, like
yes and no. Yes and no. It is true that if you're using an icon, that the icon will typically be smaller than whatever text it is, regardless of the language, right? An icon will typically take up less space, right? And so you're not going to run into this issue if you have the same icon everywhere. Okay. Now, there's a problem though. Icons are not universal, and so there's two problems there. Is depending on what you're talking about, that icon might not be easily understood, okay? Depending on what type of thing you're doing, it might not be very obvious what that icon represents, right? So some things are pretty, we see as kind of pretty obvious. We see as, okay, a plus sign is maybe add, like we can kind of understand that, add, but it can also be increment, right? It can be add or increment, so there's kind of a double meaning depending on context. And so depending on what your context is, that might not be clear. So for instance, if it's like add something to the list or add a new thing, that can be convoluted sometimes. Trash can. Okay, most people understand that as delete. What about like? We usually use an icon for like. Upvote. Right? We usually have some sort of upwards hand or downwards hand. That's a hand gesture though. Hand gestures don't mean the same thing in every culture. So anything that even resembles a hand gesture, you have to realize that might work for us. It's not necessarily going to work for every culture. In fact, there are cultures where thumbs up and thumbs down is a major insult. Right? So
what does Facebook do, like in that instance, specifically?
I don't know. I don't know what the like button looks in other countries. But that's even just things to be aware of. The things that make sense to us may not make sense to everybody, okay? So you have to talk about international audience. You also have to just talk about, does it make sense in the context in the screen where you're putting it, where that can't be misunderstood as potentially doing something else, right? And that becomes also more of an issue if you have things that aren't the norm, right? Add, delete, and upvote, downvote, like, dislike. Those kind of things are pretty well understood, but that's not going to be all of your answers, right? That's not going to be everything that you have, right? In fact, we have kind of a weird icon that you'll still see around. Save. What does it look like? Floppy disk. Okay. Who here has ever had owned or had a floppy disk? Right? Half the room. And it's going down for year to year to year to year. Right? We had these. We had the 3.5-inch ones. I've seen the 5-inch ones before that, but that was before my time. Right? So this is a rapidly aging icon, and we're still using it. Right? But it means more in its icon sense now, and less so because of its physical analog anymore. Right? We've kind of divorced the icon from, what does it actually physically represent? It still kind of represents that action, so we understand that because we've seen it in a bunch of programs, even if I've never seen one in the real world, right? So icons there's a bunch of issues there, right? One of the things that icons do give you is they do give you the ability to quickly understand it sometimes, faster than if it's a good icon, right? It gives you the ability to recognize it faster than the text, faster than you can read the text. Like, hey, most people can recognize the save icon faster than they're going to recognize the word save or publish or whatever it is, right? So there's some value in there, and it also helps with the language barrier sometimes as well. But it's not something we can necessarily use all the time, and it rarely works in this case, right? Let's talk about first name, last name. Is there a standard icon for either of those things? Most of the things you need a label for, there's not a standard icon for, right? So we come to some point where we do need text, okay? So the problem I run into buttons, hey, this text might overflow. I can have the same problem here as this gets longer. I don't want that text to either appear over the field or behind the field. Either one is bad. Right? If it appears behind, then I'm missing some characters. The user can't actually see them. If they're appearing above, then they're obscuring the text that the user is trying to type in. Right? So neither of those is acceptable. Okay? Neither of those is fine. So what do we do? Okay? Well, think about what happens here if that text gets longer. Okay? We actually have a lot more wiggle room in this vertical layout than we have in that horizontal layout. Does everybody see that? There's actually more space here to the right than there is up here, right? Because generally speaking, what we do with a horizontal layout like this, we try to find kind of the longest label and stick it right at the end of that longest label, right? And then weird things happen when you go to other languages and things get wider. And sometimes the thing that was the longest label is the shortest label, and the shortest label is the longest label, right? So we can't even rely on necessarily going to other cultures or other languages and knowing which of those labels is going to be widest. Does that make sense? You can't predict it from English to know which one's going to be wider, okay? So, things to think about. If I'm setting up this layout here, the vertical portrait layout, what am I going to set the width of that label to? set the width of this portrait size label to? Okay, two options. Thoughts? Okay, so I could send it to wrap content. Wrap content would be here. Right? Or I could set it to this one, and that would be 0 DP or match constraints, right? So I could set it either to wrap content or I could set it to 0 DP, okay? As long as the label is shorter than the width of the screen, there's no difference really between those two. Once it becomes long enough, because they can get really long, if they get long enough that it goes past the edge of the screen, one of these allows for wrapping and the other one doesn't. One of these allows for wrapping and one of these doesn't. The one that doesn't allow for wrapping is not the one with wrap in it. Just a big heads up, okay? So if I set this to wrap content, actually it's gonna let it, typically, it may let it go off the edge of the screen. If I want to keep it from going off the edge of the screen, I need it to set it to 0 DP so that it wraps. Does that make sense? Because what 0 DP actually says, it can be this at most, versus wrap content does not impose a maximum limit on it. Wrap content just say, hey, take up as much space as you want. If I don't have that much space, oh well, just take up more. Right? So the thing to understand here from setting this layout out, typically I could do one or the other, but for future-proofing yourself, you want to make sure that you set it to 0 so that it can wrap if it gets too long. Okay? Because that does happen. Yeah.
So, like the match constraint, I
Yeah.
remember just in the video, it said like for certain languages that you can't break word containing different spots, but you can change the meaning.
Yeah.
So does it account for that at all?
So that's a good question. Arabic in particular is the one where you can't break a word midway, right? You can't break a word midway. So you can wrap, but you can't break a word in the middle of the word. So I can do, effectively in Arabic, I can say, hey, here's first a name. I can break those two words onto two separate lines. That's still okay, because they're separate words, but it would be incorrect to do that. That's wrong in English, right? It doesn't make any sense in English typically to do that. Books used to do this. If you look at some old books, they'd see like N-A, M-E, but you don't usually see this anymore, and just there's no hyphenation in Arabic is the gotcha, right? So what you would see is effectively the same kind of thing in Arabic where it would be a word, right? So what you're really limited on is what is the widest word in there, right? As long as the widest word in there can fit in the screen, you've got no issue, it'll just wrap, right? So the idea being that we set this width to 0 and the height to wrap content so that that can change if it needs to go to 2 lines. Does that make sense for everybody? So that's the kind of the way we would work around it with this sort of layout. Is we say the width of that label is 0 dp, the height of it is wrapped content. That way the word wrapping works. Okay? And again, as long as you don't have an Arabic word that is so long that it's wider than this space that you have, you're okay. Right? If you're using the full width of the screen, you're probably not going to run into that issue. But if I say, hey, I want a layout that looks more like, let's say on the phone, I want to take the form and make it one part, right? So maybe over here, or even on a tablet, I'm doing one thing here as the layout, and here's my form. There's no guarantee that there aren't going to be words that are too long for that space, right? So this is where I usually say, you know, on a phone, don't try to put hardly anything next to each other, because you don't want to get to that point where you can't even fit a single word on that line. Does that make sense? So we can do that. What about this one? Okay. What are the widths of those labels? Well, oftentimes, one of the things that people start with is they start with saying, hey, let's make the width of the label wrap content. And then what happens is all of these are off kilter, and the edit text start at different places, and it looks really messy and unprofessional. Especially since when you're doing something like this, you're usually trying to make it kind of look like an actual paper form, which shouldn't be that way where it's cockeyed. Okay, so you want alignment. If you're doing this, there needs to be alignment there on that line. Right? So if I set wrap content, that means everything's not the same width. So what do I need to set the width of that to? Can I set it to 0 dp like I did in the vertical orientation?
Yeah.
You said what?
Yeah.
Why? How? What does 0 dp represent?
The space that it can possibly fill is a large number.
Okay, the space between the things it's anchored to.
Constraints.
Okay, the constraints it's anchored to.
Mm-hmm.
Which would mean you need to constrain it. It could be 0 dp if I constrained it there and constrained it here, right? Then I could do something like that. Okay, but in order for that to work, in order for me to be able to constrain it to the edge of the screen on this side and the edge of the field on this side, how wide is the field now? Because the width of the label is then dependent on the width of the field. Does that make sense? If you set up the constraints that way, then this thing depends on the width of that thing. So what do? Right? If I say this is 0, what do I say this is? Because I also want to create alignment here on that one.
Would they have to be like set widths to do that?
Yeah, right? The only way to accomplish that is that this has to be on the right, would have to be a fixed width. Okay. The only way to accomplish that is that right side would have to be a fixed width. So let's say this is 200 dp. Okay? So 200 dp on the right, 0 dp on the left. Okay? If the screen width is 400 dp, they'll be 50-50. Okay? Might look okay. What happens when I double the screen width, and it's not 400, it's 800, this is going to stay 200, and the labels are going to go up to 600 pixels wide. They're going to take up 3/4 of the screen. That's going to not look that great, right? In general, especially if I'm talking about something like first and last name, where I might want more space. If they're numbers, it might be okay because there's an upper limit to how long numbers are, right? But if I'm talking about names and strings in general, I'd like to have more space to the field if I have a bigger screen. Does that make sense? So if I set it up this way, then I'm giving all of the extra space to the label and none of the extra space to the fields. These stay 200, these grow. Okay? I still have a problem here. What happens if the label needs to wrap? Well, those labels may overlap each other, potentially, if there's not enough space on the left, right? Which now is screen size dependent, right? They might be overlapped on some person's screen and not overlapped on another screen. So maybe these two labels overlap in the phone portrait mode, but they don't overlap in a larger tablet. So I also need to avoid that sort of overlapping. Okay, that's another thing we have to watch out for, especially because the overlapping, like the wrapping, might happen in some languages, and the wrapping might not happen in other languages. So, easy thing to think about. Sometimes the right answer is to just flip it and think about it backwards, right? If we're having problems with, okay, I have a fixed width over here in this column, and this one being fluid, maybe I need to reverse it and make the other one fixed, right? So if I change all of this stuff around, all of these constraints, I go to, hey, this is 0 dp here for the field, this is 200 for the label, and now the field input is anchored to the label. Okay. That means if we get a larger screen, I've got more space for my text fields. Okay. These will stay the same size, but these will get bigger, which is going to look okay. I mean, up to a certain point, because if you've got a monitor that's this huge and the labels are like this, well then maybe you could start moving first name and last name up and just put both of those fields on the same row. So you still have to think about going up to larger screen sizes. Is everybody following with me? Okay. Now, so this is usually, it's usually better to set it up this way, with the fixed width over here and the variable over there, in general. But what problem does that cause with translation? There's two things that happen. There's two things I need to be concerned about. What happens when it's too long? When the label's too long? One of two things it can do. Michael? Chase?
Like all part of the.
Yeah, so it could cut off part of it, right? I could lose part of the label if it's too long. The other possibility is that it wraps down, okay? So I definitely don't want labels to ever be cut off. That is never a good scenario. Under no circumstance, if you're translating into another language, should you allow that to be a compromise that you cut off part of the label. That's not okay. You might be able to come up with a shorter string, a shorter word to use there in place that kind of means the same thing but is shorter, but it should never be cut off. Okay. So that means when we're designing the layout, we need to plan for those things. We need to plan for it being longer, which basically means that we need to allow for labels that are more than one line. Okay? We need to allow for labels that are more than one line. And over here, it was easy. Over here, you just say, hey, we'll make it wrap content. right? And I still want to do that same thing where I say the height of that label should be wrap content, right? It's going to be variable. It's going to be based on the number of, the amount of text is there. So anytime you're doing a label, the height of that label, period, needs to be wrap content. Make that your standard. Okay, the height should never be anything else other than wrap content. But it creates a little bit of a problem because now these fields can be misaligned, right? What I don't want to see is that the label for the second field is now down here, right? Because now this label doesn't go with that field, right? In fact, it probably looks like it goes to this field and the middle one's missing a label, okay? So how do I solve this problem? How do I arrange things so that the labels and the fields stay together, even in the presence of traffic?
So, retro, like maybe controlling the top of the info to the top of the labels?
Yeah, yeah. So I want to do, I didn't draw in, kind of intentionally, I didn't draw in my vertical constraints, but my vertical constraints on the left need to kind of look like this. And then on the right, when I'm drawing these out, I need to have these where that's anchored to here. The top of this is anchored to the top of the label. Yeah, so same one here. This top of field is anchored to top of label. That way the top of the field is always aligned with wherever the label is. Does that make sense? A common mistake, because that's not usually how people intuitively set up their layouts. Usually people, when they're starting their layout, they'll align it like this, and that's where you have the problem. Does that make sense? It's kind of a weird, in some sense, it's kind of a weird way to set it up, but it's really, really important for translations. Okay? Is everybody with me so far? So this is kind of, part of what we want. One part of what we're talking about today is how do I set up things to adapt to different languages, but I'm also just talking in general, how do we adapt screens, how do we adapt our layouts to whatever device that we're working with, okay? So one thing we have to keep in mind as we're doing this is languages are a factor. It's not just the device that you have to consider. It's not just the device that you have to consider in terms of thinking about responsive design or adaptive layouts, as we might say sometimes in the Android world. Okay? So it's more than just how big is your screen. Okay? That can influence things. So just a few examples. In terms of talking about what devices we're working with. So the idea is we want to target as many devices as possible. We've got a few different devices that we kind of classifications that you see today. So one classification you're going to see is the classical smartphone, right? It's generally taller than it is wide, right? So you know those things, but they're also usually going to be the smaller of the device. Now, smartphones have a very, very, very big range in terms of height and skinniness. In terms of form factors, there's an awful lot of range from phone to phone to phone, right? If we were to look at every student in here, you would see significant differences in widths and heights between those different phones. So one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to be too sensitive to all those those small changes. We want there to be a little bit of flex, so you can You can kind of have it be slightly wider, slightly taller, and so you have a certain range band. Okay, so but we've got that general classification of smartphone. You also have what we gave you for this class, which are 7-inch tablets. So that's kind of another size category, right? These are kind of medium-sized or small tablets, okay? And then you have what I previously taught this course with, and we don't use anymore, but these 10-inch tablets, right? And a 10-inch tablet, actually, you can use it this way, but actually it's more often used this way, whereas 7-inch is kind of in between. It's comfortable both ways, but you do have that size classification, right? And so most tablets on the market, if you kind of simplify it down, or most Android devices, you can say, hey, I've got phones, I've got a 7-inch tablet, and I've got a 10-inch tablet. Okay, because most devices will generally bucket into those different classifications. So I'll take a screenshot of what I got up on the board before I wipe it down. I'll post that in a bit. So if I bucket it out, I can say, hey, we've got smartphones, or phone. Got phone. Looks like this. I've got a 7-inch tablet, which looks a little bit bigger. And I've got a 10-inch tablet, which is bigger still, right? So I want to be able to target those different screen sizes, okay? Remember, phones can be turned on their side, so I also have the portrait, not just the portrait orientation of that, but also the tablet, the landscape orientation. Right? So in broad buckets, we're talking about really 6 different orientations, right? 6 different screen formats, screen sizes that I have to plan for, right? That's kind of a simplification, but you can generally bucket it out that way, okay? 6 in and of itself is a lot, right? If I say, hey, it takes, an hour to make one layout, now it takes 6 hours for every screen, it's kind of a big deal, right? To take a lot more time to do that. So one way I can set this up is I can make a different layout for every single one of these devices, or make a completely separate app and put it up 6 different apps onto the Play Store, but that's not really feasible, right? So ideally I want my app to work with all of these different kinds of devices, right? And so that means we have to be maybe a little bit more tricky and maybe a bit more clever and use some different techniques to do that easier, right? Take some shortcuts, okay? So one of the things you can realize, okay, this is a lot of size buckets. Six different form factors between the portrait and landscape orientations is a lot of different buckets to put things in, okay? When we did web development and we did CSS, remember working with media queries and the like, and what we landed on with media queries is using a mobile-first approach, right, with breakpoints that increase, you go based on the width of the user screen. Because it turns out that's a pretty good way to bucket it out. you say, hey, we'll start with the smallest device, we'll target it that, because it'll kind of, if I build it first for the small, it'll kind of still work for larger screens, even though maybe not ideally, but at least it'll work, right? So we start with the smallest screen, we work our way up based on the screen width, okay? It's worth asking, you know, especially in the mobile world, why are we going off of the width and not the height? Why couldn't I do my breakpoints based on the height of the devices? Rather than the width of the devices.
Probably because more often than not you're in portrait mode, so you got
Okay.
less width to work with, I guess. Or
Kind of.
Or scroll vertically.
Yeah. That's actually it's that simple. It's largely because scrolling is vertical. If we had done if users were used to horizontal scrolling, or you have a screen that's more horizontal scrolling, then it actually makes more sense to do your breakpoints vertically, right? If your scrolling is horizontal, then it actually makes more sense to do vertical breakpoints rather than horizontal breakpoints. That's really why. Is it really has to do with it's the opposite of the way we scroll. Okay? So that's why it changes the layout pretty significantly, because if I just say, okay, if these two devices have the same, let's say I've got this screen here that's this wide, and I have this screen here that's this wide, they'll probably be okay with the same layout, because this one you just scrolled more, right? You just see less at the same time. This one you're still scrolling, but you can see more at the same time, right? More of the article or more of the whatever you're scrolling through, right? So we generally just bucket things based on the width, okay? Now, there's a good handy trick, just kind of rule of thumb. This doesn't hold up well because there's a lot of different form factors. But if I take these two devices, right, I look at them in portrait mode, there's not really much in common. But look at them that way. Oftentimes 7-inch tablets have about the same height as a phone. You can look at it the other way, right? So my phone in landscape is about as wide as a tablet in portrait, right? So actually I can use the same layout for this in portrait as this in landscape, generally speaking. Does that make sense? Look at the next step up. This in landscape is pretty close to that in portrait. If I turn the screens on, it might be more clear because the screen doesn't extend all the way to the edge. Because notice you're working with the size of the actual screen and not necessarily the size of the device. So if I look at how big that screen is and how big this screen is, right? They're pretty close. So it turns out I can get away with a few less. I can get away with a few less variations because the landscape on one, or the portrait on the portrait side, the size of the portrait on one size is about, or the size of landscape on one side is about the same as portrait on the next size up. So you can kind of half the number of layouts. So that means if I bucket this a little bit differently, then I have rather than talking about those 6 buckets, I can say, hey, we've got phone and portrait. We've got this bucket here, and I've got another bucket which is phone and landscape, tablet and portrait, tablet and landscape, tablet and portrait. Okay. So here we've got phone, 7-inch tablet, 7-inch tablet, 10-inch tablet, and then I have a wider one here as well, which is the 10-inch tablet, but that is in landscape. So landscape, 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 portrait, 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 right? So I can bucket that into 4 buckets instead of 6 buckets. And it turns out that they're also pretty easy because it's easy to think about the width of the screen as being your buckets. And then think about less the combination and aspect ratio of height plus width. Height plus width becomes pretty hard to manage, or a combination of orientation plus size of device, kind of convoluted, okay? So we can simplify things, kind of taking the same approach that we borrowed from web development, where in responsive web design we use those media queries on the width. We can kind of do a similar thing on Android, right? And kind of use media queries per se, even though it's a different mechanism. Okay. Now, it turns out that in terms of bucketing it into those different sizes, okay, remember that when we're doing this in CSS, we have to draw a line that delineates where those edges are, right? Where does it change or step from this to this to this, okay? And so the way that we have traditionally done that in web development is based on certain screen resolutions that were common at the time, okay? In fact, those breakpoints are kind of not, the ones that most people use are all that great, but we have to choose some, right? And so we want to choose ones where kind of at this line, there aren't a lot of devices that are actually anywhere close to it. They're pretty far away from it, right? We don't want this line to be anywhere near actual device widths. We want it to be a clean divider between other devices around it. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So what we usually, what I've landed on and what I've kind of seen is something like this. It's not perfect. In fact, 300 is actually a little bit sometimes into the phone space. But going by steps of 300 usually puts you right about the sweet spot of those steps. And the nice thing there is it's you actually do kind of want it uniform. Because having it uniform means that you can do nice things like say, hey, I've got 1 column, 2 column, 3 columns, right? And 4 columns, right? I can just say, oh, my columns are 300 dp wide, roughly, right? And then just set the breakpoints at roughly every 300. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's how we're going to set up our breakpoints as 300, 600, 900. Okay. You can also put things in there. The next one up, I think I asked you to do is 1200 dp, but there aren't very many actually up there. The only ones that might be up here is you're talking kind of 10-inch tablets and maybe monitor screens, right? If you're trying to put that on a TV, TVs would definitely be up here in that 1200 dp range. Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of as how I'm getting here? Okay. Does that map up maybe to what you've seen with some of the web development stuff? So what we want to talk about is how can we do some of this adaptive and responsive design, how can we get layouts, how can we set up our screens to kind of work and bucket based on those different form factors. Make sense? So one of the things to be aware of, obviously, when you test this, how many different devices do you need to test this with to get this full range? Kevin said about 3, at least 3, and really you're talking potentially 4. So you're talking about, okay, you're gonna need a phone, you're gonna need a 7-inch tablet, 10-inch tablet, and maybe TV size or monitor size thing. This might also be just a monitor, a computer monitor size. So if you have your phone on you, if you have an Android phone, you might be able to use that as the lower bucket. But more than likely, you'll probably want that to be an emulator. So you'll need to have a phone emulator. You want to have your physical 7-inch tablet, and you'll need to end up setting up an emulator for the 10-inch tablet as well. These tablets that I have, I think I might have enough of them for the class, but they're all 5.0, Android 5.0. So they're actually too old to run a lot of the code that we've written this semester. So otherwise I would hand out and loan you out some 10-inch tablets, but so that upper side of things you'll need to emulate as well. Cool? So you may find yourself needing to create some additional emulators than we've done already. Okay? To get that full range. Okay? And this is pretty normal, right? It's hard to have that full there's so much variation in terms of Android devices. It would be impossible to have devices of all those different form factors. So a lot of those sites you're going to have to emulate. Right? The fact that you have one physical and the rest has to be emulated is not that unusual, okay, in terms of working with industry. Cool. So that's one thing to kind of keep in perspective is that's kind of what we're targeting and where we're working to. Okay. Let's take a quick break. We'll take a 10-minute break here, and then we'll talk about some more of the stuff on here and from the whiteboard, separate from the whiteboard. So just a quick correction. We left off and update this on the board. I put my breakpoints. I did put my breakpoints at the wrong steps. I've got it off by 1 error there. Because actually, I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. So what actually should be here is this is no marker. This is 600 dp. That is 900 dp. 1200. And that breakpoint we're not worrying about. So that's what I mistook, is because it's roughly, phone is closer to 300 in portrait and more over on the other side, and we're 600 in landscape. And similarly with the camera. So that's one quick adjustment there.